He thought the badge made him untouchable, until the room itself turned against him. The courtroom felt colder than it should have been, fluorescent lights humming above polished wood as people shifted in their seats, waiting for another routine hearing to begin, the kind that usually passed without anyone remembering it by lunch. And then she walked in, quiet, composed, almost invisible at first glance, a woman in a simple dark suit, her posture steady, her eyes scanning the room not with fear, but with something deeper, something unreadable, and no one paid attention. Not the clerk shuffling papers, not the attorneys whispering over folders, and certainly not Officer Daniel Brooks, who leaned back in his chair like he owned the air everyone was breathing. His uniform crisp, his expression sharper than necessary. The kind of man who had spent years being obeyed without question. The kind who believed he could read a person in a second and be right every time. And when his eyes landed on her, something in his expression shifted, not curiosity, not respect, but judgment, quick and unfiltered, as if her presence alone disrupted the order he thought he controlled. And you could almost feel it, that subtle tightening in the room, like a storm forming where no one expected rain, because this wasn't just another glance. It was a decision, the kind that starts small but echoes louder than anyone anticipates. And as she took a seat, calm and silent, he leaned forward slightly, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, the kind of expression that had gone unchecked for far too long. And the people around them noticed, not openly, not enough to intervene, but enough to shift uncomfortably, enough to glance away and pretend they hadn't seen it before, because they had, over and over again, in rooms just like this. And yet she didn't react, not to the look, not to the tension. She simply sat there, hands folded, breathing steady, as if she already knew how this would play out, as if she had stepped into this moment by choice, not by chance. And that was the part no one understood, not yet, because from the outside it looked ordinary, just another day, just another case, just another interaction that would fade into the background. But beneath that surface something was shifting, something precise and deliberate. And if you were paying close enough attention, you might have noticed the way a clerk paused mid-step, the way a junior officer hesitated near the doorway, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, because what was about to happen wasn't random, it wasn't accidental. It was the beginning of a moment that would flip everything. They thought they knew about power, about authority, about who really belongs in that room. And the most dangerous part was that only one person already knew the truth, and she hadn't said a single word yet. Daniel Brooks had built his reputation on moments like this, quiet rooms where authority went unquestioned and decisions were made in seconds, not minutes. And as he watched her sit there without reacting, something about her composure irritated him more than outright defiance ever could, because silence like that felt intentional, like she was choosing not to engage rather than being unable to, and that subtle difference was enough to push him closer to a line he did not even realize he was approaching. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes narrowing as if studying a problem he had already decided how to solve. And around him the courtroom continued its slow, mechanical rhythm, papers sliding across desks, keyboards tapping softly, the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway beyond the heavy wooden doors. Yet beneath it all there was a shift, small but undeniable, like a current running just under the surface. A young clerk glanced up again, this time holding her gaze a second longer than before, as if trying to place something familiar about the woman in the dark suit, while a uniformed officer near the back adjusted his stance, his posture tightening in a way that suggested unease rather than routine vigilance. And still she did nothing, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her breathing even, her eyes steady, not avoiding Daniel but not challenging him either, simply acknowledging his presence in a way that felt controlled, deliberate. That was what unsettled him, though he would not have admitted it. The sense that she was not reacting the way people usually did when confronted with his attention, because most people either shrank back or pushed back, and both reactions gave him something to work with. But this was different. This was stillness, and stillness left too much room for uncertainty. He let out a quiet breath through his nose, a faint scoff forming as he straightened his posture, the decision already forming in his mind before. He fully recognized it, because for years he had relied on instinct, on quick judgments that had rarely been challenged in any meaningful way, and each time he had been right, or at least allowed to be right. The confidence had grown, reinforced by a system that rarely asked him to reconsider. A voice echoed from the bench as the judge prepared to call the session to order, but Daniel's focus remained fixed, his attention narrowing until the rest of the room blurred into background noise. And, in that narrowing focus, he missed the subtle signals building around him. The exchanged glances, the quiet tension, the way the atmosphere had shifted from passive observation to something closer to anticipation. If anyone had spoken up at that moment, if anyone had interrupted the silence with a simple word of caution, perhaps the course of what followed would have changed, but no one did. Because moments like these rarely announce themselves as turning points while they are happening. They feel ordinary, almost forgettable, until they are not. She adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, and for a brief second something caught the light beneath the fabric, something metallic, something official, but it disappeared as quickly as it had been revealed, and Daniel did not see it. Or if he did, he dismissed it without thought, because his mind was already committed to the version of reality he believed in, one where he held control, one where he defined the boundaries. And as the judge's voice finally rose to begin the proceedings, Daniel Brooks made a choice, a small step forward in his mind that felt routine, justified, even necessary, not knowing that this single moment, this quiet decision made in a room full of witnesses, would soon echo far beyond those walls and leave him standing in a reality he had never prepared for. The judge's voice carried across the room, steady and procedural, calling the session to order, but it barely cut through the tension that had begun to settle like a quiet weight over everyone present. And as people adjusted in their seats and papers were aligned into neat stacks, Daniel Brooks rose to his feet with a confidence that had been practiced over years, his movements controlled, deliberate, the kind that signaled authority without needing to announce it. Yet beneath that confidence, there was something sharper now, something more focused, because his attention had not left her, not for a second. Ava Carter remained seated for a moment longer, as if allowing the room to move around her before she joined it. And when she finally stood, it was with a calm precision that drew subtle attention from those paying close enough notice, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, her presence steady in a way that did not ask for recognition, but seemed to command it anyway. A faint murmur rippled from the back rows, quickly suppressed, but enough to suggest that not everyone saw her as invisible anymore. And Daniel noticed that too, though he interpreted it differently, mistaking quiet curiosity for validation of his own instincts. Because in his mind, moments like this always confirmed what he already believed, that he was the one maintaining order, that he was the one who decided who belonged and who did not. He took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to make his presence unavoidable, and the air seemed to tighten again, a subtle shift that made a few heads turn, a few breaths pause, as if something unspoken was about to surface. Ava met his movement without retreating, her gaze lifting to meet his, not with defiance, not with submission, but with a level calm that made the space between them feel charged, like two completely different understandings of power had just collided in silence. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the courtroom to feel it, long enough for the clerk near the bench to glance toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in, long enough for the officer at the back to shift his weight again, his hand hovering near his radio, without fully committing to the motion. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice measured but edged with something that had less to do with procedure and more to do with assumption, a tone that suggested he had already made his decision before any words were exchanged. And though the exact phrasing was controlled, the meaning behind it was unmistakable. It carried the weight of dismissal, of placing someone into a category without asking who they really were. A few people in the room exchanged quick looks, subtle but telling, the kind that said they had seen this pattern before, the kind that carried both recognition and hesitation, because challenging it was never simple, never without consequence. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a shift now, almost imperceptible, a slight narrowing of her eyes, not in anger, not in fear, but in focus, as if she was measuring something, calculating, deciding when and how this moment would unfold. And for the first time, there was a sense that she was not reacting to the situation, she was guiding it, even if no one else realized it yet. Daniel took another step, reinforcing his position, his certainty, and in doing so, he moved further into a moment he believed he controlled, unaware that each word, each action, each assumption was aligning perfectly with something already set in motion, something larger than this room, something that had been waiting for him to reveal exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. The courtroom held its breath again, the kind of collective pause that comes just before a turning point, and somewhere beyond the doors, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway, growing closer, though no one inside could yet see what was coming. And as Daniel continued forward, convinced of his authority, Ava Carter stood perfectly still, her composure unshaken, her silence louder than anything he could say, because she already knew something he did not, and in a matter of moments, that difference would change everything. The words Daniel chose next were not loud, not explosive, but they carried the kind of weight that made the room shift again, subtle yet unmistakable, because tone alone can draw a line between authority and assumption, and his tone made it clear which side he believed he stood on. He spoke as if he was correcting something out of place, as if her very presence required explanation, and a few heads lowered instinctively, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the pattern, the familiar rhythm of someone using position as proof instead of evidence. Ava did not interrupt, did not react in the way most would expect. She simply listened, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had heard variations of this moment before, as if this was not new territory for her, but a path she had already walked many times. And that quiet familiarity gave her a kind of control that did not need to announce itself. The judge cleared his throat lightly, a small attempt to pull the focus back to procedure, but it did little to break the tension that had settled between them, because everyone could feel it now, the shift from routine to something else, something heavier, something that would not simply pass without consequence. Daniel took another measured step, closing the space further, reinforcing his presence, and in that movement there was certainty, the kind that comes from years of being unchallenged, from decisions made quickly and rarely questioned, and yet that certainty was beginning to press against something it could not quite define, a resistance that did not come from defiance but from stillness. Ava's eyes followed him, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with a quiet awareness, and in that awareness there was something else, something deeper, as if she was not only seeing him but also the outcome of what he was doing, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment in her mind and was simply allowing it to unfold. A soft sound echoed from the hallway again, footsteps closer now, more defined, and the officer near the back finally touched his radio, not activating it, just resting his hand there as if preparing for a possibility he could not yet name. Daniel spoke again, his voice carrying that same controlled edge, reinforcing his earlier point, framing the situation in a way that placed him firmly in control. And yet the more he spoke, the more the room seemed to resist him, not openly, not enough to challenge him directly, but enough to create a subtle friction, a hesitation in the air that had not been there before. A woman seated in the second row shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around a pen, while a young attorney glanced toward the door again, his expression tightening, as if he recognized something about the timing of what was happening. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried intention. And for a brief second the edge of something metallic caught the light again beneath her sleeve, just a flash, gone as quickly as it appeared. And still Daniel did not register it, because his focus was locked on maintaining the version of authority he believed defined this space. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, a reminder of order, but it sounded distant now, almost secondary to the quiet collision unfolding in front of everyone. And in that moment the balance of the room felt fragile, like something was about to tip, like one more step, one more word, would push everything past a point that could not be reversed. Daniel took that step, reinforcing his position, unaware that he was also stepping directly into a moment that had been building long before he recognized it. And Ava Carter remained exactly where she was, calm, composed, unshaken, her silence no longer passive but powerful, because it was no longer a reaction, it was a choice, and in that choice was the certainty that the truth, when it finally arrived, would not need to raise its voice to be heard. There is a moment in every room where power is misjudged, when the air changes before anyone understands why, and this was that moment. Daniel Brooks could feel it without naming it, a subtle resistance pressing back against his certainty, yet instead of stepping away, he leaned further into it, because stepping back had never been part of the way he operated, not in 15 years, not in a system that had taught him that hesitation looked like weakness. His voice came again, controlled but firmer now, as if repetition alone could reinforce the authority he believed he held. And while the words themselves remained within the boundaries of procedure, the intent behind them carried something sharper, something that suggested he had already decided the outcome before the process had even begun. A faint murmur traveled through the room, quickly suppressed, but it lingered in the edges of awareness, a reminder that not everyone was comfortable with the direction things were moving. Even if no one spoke it aloud, Ava Carter remained exactly where she was, her composure unchanged. But there was a quiet shift in her presence now, something that was not visible in movement, but felt in the way the space around her seemed steadier, as if she was anchoring herself to something beyond the moment, beyond the assumptions being placed on her. She lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as if she was marking the exact point where everything would begin to turn, and that small movement did not go unnoticed. Not by the clerk who had been watching too closely, not by the officer at the back whose hand now rested fully on his radio, not by the attorney who had stopped pretending to read his notes. Daniel noticed it too, but he interpreted it as confirmation, as resistance that needed to be addressed, because in his mind stillness like hers was not control, it was defiance waiting to surface, and he had built his career on confronting that exact perception. He took another step, closing the final gap that remained between them, and in doing so, he crossed an invisible threshold, one that separated assumption from consequence, though he did not feel it under his feet, did not hear it in the silence that followed, did not recognize it in the way the room seemed to hold its breath all at once. The judge shifted in his seat, the faint sound of wood against fabric echoing softly, as if preparing to intervene. But even that movement came a fraction too late, because timing in moments like these does not wait for permission. It aligns itself with inevitability. Ava's eyes met Daniel's fully now, no longer observing, no longer measuring, but settling. And in that settling there was certainty, not the kind that comes from belief, but the kind that comes from knowledge. And for the first time, there was something else beneath her calm, something that hinted at what was coming, something that suggested this moment was not unfolding unpredictably, but exactly as it had been expected to. A distant sound cut through the tension, clearer now, the unmistakable rhythm of multiple footsteps moving in sync down the hallway. Purposeful, coordinated, and though no one had yet turned to look, everyone heard it, everyone felt it, like a signal that something larger was about to enter the room. Daniel did not turn, did not break his focus, because in his mind nothing outside of his control mattered. Not yet, not until it forced itself into his awareness. And so he continued, reinforcing his position with one final assertion, a line drawn in words that he believed defined the limits of the space they stood in. But the moment he finished speaking, the doors behind them began to open, slow at first, then with quiet authority, and the sound alone was enough to shift every eye in the room. Enough to break the invisible barrier that had held everyone still, and in that exact second, before anyone had even stepped through, Ava Carter allowed the smallest breath to leave her chest. Not relief, not tension, but recognition, because the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived, and everything Daniel believed about control was about to be tested by a truth he never saw coming. The doors did not slam open, they did not need to. Because authority rarely announces itself with noise, it arrives with certainty. And as they moved inward on silent hinges, the shift in the room was immediate, undeniable, the kind that travels faster than sound, faster than thought, reaching every person before they could fully understand why. Conversations stopped without being told, papers remained half-turned, and even the faint hum of the lights seemed to fade into the background as three figures stepped inside. Their presence composed, deliberate, each movement aligned with purpose rather than urgency. And for the first time since he had entered that space, Daniel Brooks hesitated, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to call it hesitation, but internally, a brief flicker, a disruption in the rhythm he had been following so confidently. He did not turn right away, his posture still. Forward, his stance still firm, because habits like his were not easily broken. They resisted change even when it stood directly behind them. But the room had already shifted around him, attention redirected, focus pulled away from his control and towards something else, something he had not anticipated. Ava Carter did not move. She did not step back. She did not acknowledge the entrance with anything more than the slightest adjustment of her breath, as if the moment unfolding was exactly as it should be, as if every second had been accounted for long before anyone else realized they were part of it. The footsteps that had echoed through the hallway now settled into the room itself, steady, measured, each step carrying weight without force. And as they came to a stop just behind Daniel, the silence deepened, not empty but full, filled with expectation, with recognition that something had crossed into a space where it could not be ignored. A voice spoke, calm, clear, not raised, yet it cut through everything. Officer Brooks. And in those two words there was no accusation, no anger, just acknowledgement, the kind that does not ask for attention but receives it anyway. And Daniel turned then, slowly, not because he chose to, but because something in that voice required it. His eyes met the figures behind him, and for a fraction of a second the room seemed to tilt, not physically, but in perception, because what he saw did not align with the version of reality he had been operating under moments before. The officer at the back straightened immediately, his hand dropping from the radio, as if a decision had been made for him. The clerk lowered her gaze, but not in avoidance, in recognition. And the judge, who had been preparing to intervene, now sat completely still, his earlier authority replaced by something more cautious, more observant. Daniel's expression did not collapse, not yet, but the certainty within it shifted, subtle but real, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had always seemed solid. And in that shift there was the first sign that control was no longer where he believed it to be. Ava finally moved, not stepping away, not stepping forward, just turning slightly, enough to acknowledge the presence behind Daniel without breaking her focus entirely. And in that movement there was alignment, a quiet confirmation that everything happening now was connected, that this was not interruption, it was continuation. The man who had spoken stepped forward just enough to be fully seen, his posture formal, his expression composed, and without raising his voice, without altering his tone, he added a single line that carried more weight than anything that had been said before. You might want to take a step back. And for the first time, Daniel Brooks understood that the moment was no longer his to control, that whatever he thought he had been managing had already moved beyond him. And as the room held its breath once more, Ava Carter's hand lifted slightly toward her coat, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, and the quiet certainty in that motion told a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud, a truth that was about to redefine everything he thought he knew about who held power in that room. Time does not always slow down when everything changes. Sometimes it sharpens, every second becoming clearer, heavier, impossible to ignore. And that was exactly what happened in that room, as Ava Carter's hand moved toward her coat with quiet precision, not rushed, not hesitant, but certain. And in that single motion something invisible shifted completely. Because intention has a way of revealing itself before truth is even spoken, Daniel Brooks saw it. He could not look away from it. And for the first time his instincts did not guide him forward. They held him still, caught between what he believed and what he was beginning to question. And that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, not by the officers who had entered, not by the judge whose eyes now followed every movement with careful attention, not by the room that had fully transitioned from passive observation to silent anticipation. Ava's fingers brushed against the inside of her coat, and when she withdrew her hand, it was not with force or flourish, it was steady, controlled, revealing a badge that caught the overhead light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if the room itself needed to see it clearly, needed to understand before anyone spoke a single word. The effect was immediate, not explosive, but absolute. like a line drawn in reality that could not be erased once seen, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything before, because now it was no longer built on uncertainty. It was built on recognition. Daniel's eyes locked onto the badge, and in that instant the structure he had relied on began to fracture, not loudly, not visibly to everyone, but internally, where certainty once lived without question, now replaced by something unfamiliar, something heavier, the realization that the situation in front of him was not what he had assumed it to be. The officer behind him straightened further, his posture no longer casual but formal, respectful, as if responding to a presence that required acknowledgement beyond routine. And the clerk who had been watching lowered her gaze completely now, not out of discomfort but out of understanding, as if the answer to a question she had not voiced had just been placed directly in front of her. Ava held the badge at a level that made it impossible to dismiss, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on Daniel, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had defined her silence. "Ava Carter," she said, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly, each word landing with precision. "Your new police chief." And in that moment, the air in the room shifted again, but this time it did not tighten, it settled, as if everything had finally aligned with the truth it had been resisting. Daniel did not move, not immediately, because understanding like that does not arrive all at once. It unfolds, piece by piece, breaking through layers of assumption until there is nothing left to hold on to. And in his eyes there was a flicker of something that had never been there before, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when control slips away and cannot be reclaimed by force or voice. The man who had entered earlier stepped slightly closer, his presence now clearly aligned with hers, not above, not beside, but supporting a structure Daniel had not even realized existed in that moment. And the judge finally leaned forward, his authority returning, but this time it was directed differently, recalibrated to the truth that had just been revealed. Ava lowered the badge slowly, not to hide it, but because it had already done what it needed to do, and as her hand returned to her side, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was resolved, filled with the weight of a reality that could not be undone, and Daniel Brooks stood in the center of it, facing a moment that had shifted beyond anything he had prepared for, a moment where every assumption he had made was now laid bare under a truth that did not need to raise its voice to take control. Silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means everything has already been decided. And in that courtroom, the silence that followed Ava Carter's words was no longer uncertain. It was final, the kind that settles into people's bones before they even understand why. Daniel Brooks felt it first in his chest, not as panic, not as fear, but as a shift, a quiet collapse of something he had relied on for years, the certainty that had guided every decision, every assumption, every step forward, without hesitation, and now that certainty had nowhere to stand. He blinked once, slowly, as if trying to reset the moment, to find a version of it that still made sense, but the badge had already been seen, the name had already been spoken, and there was no space left for interpretation. Around him, the room adjusted in ways that were small but unmistakable. The officer at the back straightened fully, no longer observing but standing in clear alignment. The clerk who had once hesitated now moved with quiet efficiency, organizing papers that suddenly carried more weight than before, and the judge, who had been a distant authority only moments ago, now leaned forward with focused intent, his presence recalibrated to a reality that demanded attention. Ava did not step closer, did not raise her voice, did not need to, because authority does not always move. Sometimes it simply exists and everything else shifts around it, and she held that space effortlessly, her posture steady, her expression composed, her eyes never leaving Daniel, as if allowing him the time he needed to understand what had just happened. The man beside her spoke again, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that carried across the room, outlining procedures, referencing protocols, words that sounded routine on the surface but carried consequences beneath them. And each word landed with precision, not rushed, not delayed, as if the moment had been prepared long before it arrived. Daniel heard it all, every word, every shift, every breath in the room. And yet for a brief second it felt distant, like he was standing just outside of it, watching something unfold that he had not meant to start. And in that distance there was realization, not immediate, not complete, but growing, expanding with every second that passed. He lowered his gaze slightly, just enough to break the direct line he had held with Ava, and in that small movement the room saw something they had not seen before, not weakness, but acknowledgement, the first sign that the balance had changed. Ava's voice came again, calm, steady, not accusatory, not emotional, simply factual, outlining what had been observed, what had been recorded, and what would follow. And there was no need for emphasis because the truth does not require it. It carries its own weight. The footsteps that had once approached the room now remained still, positioned, present, a quiet reinforcement that this was no longer a single interaction. It was a moment connected to something larger, something structured, something that did not rely on assumption but on accountability. Daniel took a breath, deeper this time, and as he exhaled, the last fragments of the situation he thought he controlled slipped away completely, replaced by a clarity he had not prepared for, the understanding that this was not about a single decision, not about a single moment, but about everything that had led to it. Ava finally shifted her stance, just slightly, enough to signal that the moment had moved forward, that what came next would not be decided by impulse, but by process. And as she did, the room followed, not in movement, but in alignment, because the truth had already taken its place, and nothing that had happened before could change what was about to happen next. There is a difference between being corrected and being confronted by truth, and Daniel Brooks felt that difference settle over him as the room moved forward without waiting for him to catch up, because moments like this do not pause for understanding. They continue, they unfold, and they leave people to adjust as best they can. The procedures being spoken around him were clear, structured, precise, each step following the next with a calm certainty that did not rush, yet did not hesitate. And in that rhythm, there was no space for the kind of control he had relied on before, no opening for interpretation, no room for assumption. He stood there, shoulders still squared out of habit, but the meaning behind that posture had changed, because it was no longer a display of authority, it was a position without direction, a stance waiting to be redefined by something outside of his control. Ava Carter watched him for a moment longer, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a level focus that suggested this was never personal. This was process, this was accountability. And in that distinction, there was something far more powerful than any reaction could have been. The judge's voice entered the space again, steady and firm, guiding the room back into its formal structure, acknowledging what had been revealed and what would follow. And for the first time since the session had begun, his authority aligned fully with the truth in front of him, not with assumption, not with routine, but with clarity. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, a small adjustment, but enough to show that the internal balance he had once held was no longer steady. And as he did, the eyes of the room followed, not with hostility, not with sympathy, but with awareness, the kind that comes when a moment has redefined what everyone thought they understood. Ava stepped forward then, not to close distance, not to assert dominance, but to take her place within the structure that had been waiting for her, her movement calm, measured, intentional. And as she did, the officers who had entered aligned themselves accordingly, their presence no longer just an arrival, but a confirmation of what had already been set in motion. She spoke again, her voice carrying the same clarity as before, outlining next steps, referencing standards, not raising her tone, not altering her pace, because the weight of her words did not come from how they were delivered, but from what they represented. Daniel listened, and this time he did not interrupt, did not step forward, did not attempt to reclaim the space, because there was nothing left to reclaim, only something to understand, something to face. And that realization settled slowly but firmly, grounding him in a reality he could not shift with words alone. A faint movement near the back of the room drew brief attention. Someone stepping aside, making space, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Because the moment had expanded beyond a single interaction, it had become something that would be remembered, something that would carry beyond these walls. Ava paused just long enough for the room to absorb what had been said, and in that pause there was no tension, no uncertainty, only the quiet weight of a process that had already begun. and as she lowered her gaze briefly to the documents now placed before her, the final shift became clear. This was no longer about what had happened in the moment. It was about what would happen next. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the space around him. And for the first time, there was no attempt to fill the silence, no need to assert anything, because the room had already moved past that point. And as the proceedings continued, structured, deliberate, unshaken, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that authority is not defined by who claims it, but by who carries it when it matters most. And in that courtroom, on that day, everyone had seen the difference.